The envelope was the color of a dead man's skin, bone white and smelling of sterile offices. Elias held it with hands that looked like the roots of an old oak, trembling just enough to make the heavy paper rattle. The county seal sat at the top, a cold, golden stamp of authority, declaring that his dirt was no longer dirt. They called it an ecological liability. They called it sterile, toxic, and unfit for the plow. According to the high office, this patch of earth was a ghost. But Elias knew better. He knew the secrets sleeping beneath the frost, waiting for a man who understood that life doesn't come from a ledger. If you believe the land has a soul that no bureaucrat can ever own, subscribe to Beyond the Fields and stand with us. This is the story of a man told his soil was dead, and the 400 families who proved the county wrong. The fence line on the eastern edge of Elias's property was more than just rusted wire and silver-gray cedar posts. It was a diary written in iron. Every staple he had hammered in over 40 years told a story of a winter that tried to break him, or a spring that nearly drowned the calves. To the people in the valley, this wasn't just a farm. It was the North Star. When the grocery store chains started pushing out the local markets and the prices of eggs climbed higher than a summer hawk, people looked toward Elias. They looked at the smoke rising from his chimney and felt a sense of continuity that the modern world was trying its hardest to erase. The community relied on this dirt. It wasn't about fancy labels or organic certifications. It was about the fact that if a neighbor's well went dry, Elias had a bucket. If a family's pantry was bare in the lean months of February, there was always a sack of potatoes or a jar of pickled beets waiting on his porch. The dirt here had a memory. It remembered his grandfather's boots and the sweat of his father during the Great Depression. The soil was built on layers of compost, manure, and the quiet prayers of men who didn't know how to do anything else but work. But the world outside the valley was changing. The concrete was creeping closer every year. You could hear the roar of the interstate if the wind blew from the south, a constant hungry hum of people moving too fast to see the hawks circling the meadow. The town of Oak Haven was being swallowed by its own ambition. New houses were going up, the kind with thin walls and no yards, built for people who didn't know the difference between a shovel and a spade. These newcomers looked at Elias's rolling hills and saw wasted space. They saw a relic of a dying age. They didn't understand that the roots of this farm went deeper than any foundation they could pour. The community's reliance on this patch of dirt was a silent pact. When the local mill closed down and 50 men lost their livelihoods, it was Elias who partitioned off a corner of the south field for community gardens. He didn't charge a dime. He just told them to keep the weeds down and share what they didn't need. That was the law of the land. It was a law written in the grit under their fingernails and the shared ache in their backs at the end of a long July day. But that pact was being threatened by a different kind of law, one written on expensive stationery by men who had never seen a sunrise from the seat of a tractor. They looked at the encroaching modern world and saw Elias as an eyesore, a stubborn knot in the grain of their progress. They didn't see the families who lived off his surplus, or the children who learned where milk came from in his barn. They just saw a tax liability that wasn't producing enough revenue for the county's growing appetite. They wanted the land to be something else, something profitable, something paved. But Elias knew that once you cover the earth in concrete, it never breathes again. He felt the weight of every ancestor who had turned this soil, urging him to stand fast. The history of the farm was a heavy cloak, but it was one he wore with pride. He remembered the year the drought took everyone else's corn, but his stayed green because he knew where the deep moisture sat in the hollow. He remembered the floods of '98, when his high ground became a sanctuary for the neighbors' livestock. This farm was the heartbeat of a community that was slowly being choked out by the noise of the new world. Every time a new developer's truck drove past, kicking up dust and lingering near the gate, Elias felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He knew the predators were circling. They didn't want his crops. They wanted his silence. They wanted the land to be as empty and soulless as their balance sheets. But as long as Elias had a pulse and a handful of seed, he wasn't going to let the history of this place be buried under a strip mall parking lot. He spent his evenings walking the perimeter, touching the old stones of the foundation, feeling the vibration of the earth. It was a living thing, and it was his responsibility to protect it. The town might be turning its back on the old ways, but the soil didn't forget. It waited. It held the breath of 100 seasons, prepared to fight alongside the man who had tended it for a lifetime. The encroaching concrete was loud, but the dirt was patient, and Elias was a man who had learned the value of waiting for the right moment to strike. The man in the charcoal suit didn't belong in a place that smelled of diesel and damp hay. His name was Marcus Thorne, and he represented a conglomerate that saw the valley not as a home, but as a grid of potential revenue units. Thorne arrived in a black SUV that looked like a polished obsidian tooth, parking it right across Elias's driveway, as if the concept of a right-of-way didn't apply to men with seven-figure budgets. He stepped out, careful to avoid the mud, his eyes scanning the horizon with the cold calculation of a wolf looking at a limping deer. Beside him were his allies, county officials who had traded their flannel shirts for ties and forgotten the taste of well water. They viewed Elias's farm as a worthless tax liability. In their eyes, the soil was played out, the barn was a structural hazard, and the man himself was just a stubborn obstacle to a new strip mall that would bring vitality to the region. Thorne didn't see the beauty of a windbreak or the complex ecology of a fallow field. He saw a brownfield site that needed to be mitigated, cleared, and paved. He spoke in a language of buzzwords: optimization, tax base expansion, and urban renewal. To Thorne, the silt in the creek wasn't a sign of a healthy watershed. It was a drainage issue that needed to be piped and buried. He approached Elias with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a practiced expression of condescending concern. He offered a buyout that sounded like a lot of money to anyone who didn't know the value of a legacy, but to Elias, it was an insult wrapped in a bribe. Thorne's corporate allies had already done the legwork. They had filed reports, conducted independent soil samples, and whispered in the ears of the zoning board. They claimed the land was contaminated from decades of unregulated farming, a convenient lie designed to drive the property value down and the pressure up. They wanted to categorize the farm as an industrial hazard, a move that would allow the county to seize it through eminent domain if Elias didn't sell voluntarily. It was a classic pincer move, the suit on one side with the money, and the silt of bureaucracy on the other with the threats. They underestimated the farmer, of course. They saw a man in stained overalls and assumed a lack of intelligence. They didn't realize that a man who can predict the weather by the way his joints ache or troubleshoot a 50-year-old engine with a piece of wire and a prayer has a different kind of sharpness. Elias watched them from his porch, his face as unreadable as a stone wall. He listened to Thorne talk about the inevitability of progress and the needs of the modern consumer. He watched the way the county assessor looked at his shoes instead of Elias's eyes. These were men who lived in air-conditioned bubbles, far removed from the consequences of their decisions. They didn't know that the silt they despised was the very lifeblood of the valley, a rich deposit of minerals that had built the bones of everyone who lived there. To them, the land was a dead thing to be exploited. To Elias, it was a debt he owed to the future. The tension between the soot and the silt grew thicker with every visit. Thorne started sending surveyors who trespassed with a sense of entitlement, driving stakes into the ground that Elias would quietly pull up and burn in his wood stove that night. The corporate machine was grinding into gear, fueled by the arrogance of the wealthy, who believed that everything had a price. They saw the farm as a void on their map, a dark spot that needed to be filled with neon signs and asphalt. They didn't understand the resilience of the man they were trying to displace. Elias knew that Thorne and his allies were like a summer storm, loud, destructive, and ultimately passing. But they were a storm that could level a house if you weren't prepared. He began to see the way they looked at the community too, not as neighbors, but as a labor pool or a customer base. The strip mall they planned wasn't for the people of Oak Haven. It was for the commuters who would speed through without ever stopping to smell the rain. The soot and the silt represented a vision of the world where nothing was sacred and everything was for sale. But they were about to find out that Elias's soil had a way of holding on to what belonged to it, and no amount of corporate posturing could change the chemical composition of a man's resolve. The town hall was packed, the air heavy with the smell of wet wool and the nervous energy of a community on the brink. Elias sat in the front row, his back straight despite the weight of the moment. On the dais sat the county commissioners, flanked by Marcus Thorne and a team of environmental consultants who looked like they had never stepped off a sidewalk. This was the moment they had been building toward, the official declaration of the farm's fate. The head commissioner, a man Elias had once helped pull out of a snowbank, wouldn't look him in the eye as he tapped the gavel. The presentation began with a series of high-definition slides filled with red zones and terrifying charts. The consultants used words like carcinogenic runoff, total soil sterility, and irreparable toxicity. They claimed that decades of Elias's traditional methods had poisoned the earth, making it a danger to the public health. It was a public execution of a reputation. The room went silent as they showed a map of the farm, shaded in a sickly purple to represent the dead zones where nothing could grow. They called the soil sterile, a word that cut Elias deeper than any knife. To a farmer, sterility is a death sentence, a rejection of the very purpose of his existence. The humiliation was calculated. Thorne stood up and spoke about the tragedy of a man who had loved his land to death, offering a feigned sympathy that made the locals whisper in discomfort. He painted Elias as a relic, a man whose ignorance had created a wasteland that only corporate intervention could fix. The county declared that the farm was a public nuisance, and that the only solution was to condemn the property, scrape away the toxic topsoil, and repurpose the land for safe, modern development. Elias was given 5 minutes to speak. He stood up, his boots echoing on the hardwood floor. He didn't have slides or charts. He just had his voice, which sounded like gravel grinding together. He told them that the land wasn't dead. It was just resting. He told them that the soil samples were taken from the one rocky outcrop where he had never planted, a deliberate manipulation of the truth. but his words were drowned out by the manufactured evidence. The commissioners voted unanimously to authorize the seizure. The crowd's reaction was a mix of horror and a terrible sinking realization that the world they knew was being dismantled by decree. Elias left the building to the sound of cameras clicking and the smug smiles of the developers. He felt the eyes of his neighbors on him, some with pity, some with a newfound fear that the land he had shared with them was actually a poison. It was the lowest point of his 70 years. He returned to his farm that night, the silence of the fields feeling like a shroud. The county's ink was dry, and according to the law, he was a man living on a graveyard. He walked out into the north pasture, kneeling down to run his hand through the dirt. It felt cool and moist, vibrating with a life that the experts said didn't exist. He knew they were lying, but he also knew that the truth doesn't matter if nobody is willing to look for it. The humiliation burned in his chest, a hot ember of resentment that threatened to consume him. He saw the stakes clearly now. If he lost this land, he wasn't just losing his home, he was letting the memory of his people be erased by a lie. The community respect he had spent a lifetime building was crumbling under the weight of the county's declaration. He could see the lights of the town in the distance, a place that had just turned its back on him. The arrogance of the powerful had never felt so heavy. They thought they had won because they had a gavel and a stamp. They thought the soil was a passive thing that would submit to their labels. But as the moon rose over the ridge, Elias felt a surge of a different kind of energy. If the world thought his soil was dead, he would let them believe it for a little while longer. He had secrets that no lab test could ever find, and he had a plan that started with a single ancient seed. He wouldn't fight them with lawyers or protests. He would fight them with the one thing they couldn't control, the life force of the earth itself. The night was long and the shame was heavy, but Elias began to move. He had work to do, and the darkness was his only ally. While the county was busy drafting the final eviction papers and Marcus Thorne was celebrating at the local country club, Elias was awake in the hours when the world is at its coldest. He didn't use the tractor. Its engine was too loud, a beacon that would draw the curious or the suspicious. Instead, he pulled out the old horse-drawn plow that had belonged to his grandfather, a skeleton of iron that still knew the language of the earth. He worked by the dim light of a hooded lantern, his movements rhythmic and steady. He wasn't just planting, he was performing an act of resurrection. Years ago, Elias had found a series of journals in the attic, written in a cramped script by an ancestor who had survived the Dust Bowl. They spoke of the deep pulse, hidden natural springs that ran like veins beneath the limestone layers of the valley. Elias had spent his youth mapping these pulses, learning how to tap into them without draining the surface water. He began to clear the silt from the ancient stone channels he had built decades ago and then hidden under layers of mulch. As the water began to flow, a soft, musical gurgle in the dark, he applied techniques that the modern world had long forgotten. He used a mixture of biochar he had burned in secret and a compost tea brewed from the forest floor, a concentrate of fungi and bacteria that could wake up even the most tired dirt. He was turning the dead earth into a thriving sanctuary, 1 square foot at a time. The sterile soil the county had mocked was actually a rich, dark loam that he had been building in secret for years, hidden beneath a sacrificial layer of dry, dusty topsoil. He planted seeds that weren't found in any corporate catalog, heirloom varieties of corn that could grow 6 feet tall in a month, squash that could feed a family of 4 from a single vine, and potatoes that tasted like the earth itself. He worked until his hands bled, and his back felt like it was made of rusted hinges. Under the cover of night, the farm began to transform. The hidden springs provided a constant, cool hydration that defied the summer heat, while the surrounding hills acted as a natural amphitheater, trapping the moisture. Elias moved like a ghost through his own fields, a shadow among shadows. He knew the risks. If he were caught, they would call it a violation of the environmental order. They would say he was tampering with a toxic site. But the plants didn't care about orders. They responded to the water and the rich, dark nutrients with a ferocity that was almost frightening. Green shoots began to pierce the surface, stronger and more vibrant than anything Elias had ever seen. He was creating a secret Eden in the middle of what the world believed was a wasteland. He felt a deep, primal connection to the task. It was no longer about survival. It was about the legacy of the land and a moral redemption that could only be earned through sweat. Every seed he tucked into the earth was a silent no to the men in suits. Every drop of water was a defiance of the county's dry ink. He watched the moon wax and wane, his only witness to the miracle unfolding in the hollow. The community still looked at him with pity when he went into town for supplies. But Elias just nodded and kept his eyes on the ground. He could smell the change in the air, the scent of growing things, of wet earth and ripening sugar. The birds knew it, too. They began to return to his fields in droves, their songs a sharp contrast to the silence of the neighboring properties. Elias was building a fortress of life, a sanctuary that would soon be impossible to hide. He knew the climax was coming. He knew the day would arrive when the suits would come to claim their prize, expecting to find a graveyard. But he was ready. He had fed the earth, and now the earth was preparing to feed his people. The secrets in the seedbed were growing stronger every day, fueled by ancient wisdom and the unbreakable spirit of a man who refused to let his home be turned into a commodity. The arrogance of the powerful was about to meet the quiet, relentless power of the soil. As the first hint of autumn color touched the maples, Elias stood at the edge of his field and looked at the bounty. It was more than a harvest. It was a testament. It was the land speaking back, and its voice was going to be heard across the entire county. The morning of the final seizure arrived with a crisp, biting wind that carried the scent of wood smoke and turning leaves. Marcus Thorne arrived first, leading a small fleet of white trucks filled with demolition crews and surveyors. Behind them came the county sheriff and the commissioners, their faces set in the grim masks of people doing unpleasant but necessary work. They expected to find a barren, dusty lot, the final proof of Elias's failure. They had the legal papers, the heavy machinery, and the absolute certainty of their own righteousness. But as the convoy rounded the final bend into the valley, the lead vehicle screeched to a halt. The arrogance in Thorne's eyes vanished, replaced by a flickering, wide-eyed confusion. The dead farm was gone. In its place was a sea of gold and green so vibrant it looked like a painting. The corn stood tall and proud, its tassels dancing in the wind like the plumes of a victorious army. Huge orange pumpkins glowed in the furrows like fallen suns, and the air was thick with the heavy, sweet scent of ripening fruit and damp, healthy earth. Elias was standing at the gate, not with a shotgun, but with a simple wooden crate. Beside him stood the families he had fed for years, 400 people from the valley, the ones the county had forgotten. They had arrived at dawn, summoned by a word of mouth that moved faster than any digital signal. They stood in a silent, solid line, a human wall between the dirt and the machines. Thorne stepped out of his car, his voice cracking as he tried to reassert control. He shouted about the soil reports, about the toxicity, about the legal mandate to clear the site. Elias didn't say a word. He simply reached down, pulled a massive carrot from the earth, and wiped the rich black soil onto his pants. He handed it to the county sheriff. The sheriff, a man who knew the difference between a lie and a miracle, took a bite. The crunch echoed in the sudden silence of the valley. It was the taste of a harvest that shouldn't exist, a bounty that rendered every corporate claim a fraud. The people began to move then, not in a riot, but in a harvest. They flooded the fields with baskets and bags, picking the corn, digging the potatoes, and gathering the squash. They were hungry, not just for food, but for the truth. The county's sterility claims were being dismantled with every ear of corn that was shucked. It was a harvest of crow for the men in suits. They stood frozen as the community they had tried to manipulate reclaimed its own lifeblood. The news crews, tipped off by the locals, arrived just in time to film the spectacle, a toxic wasteland, feeding an entire county. The developers' allies began to melt away, sensing the shift in the wind. The commissioners looked at the crowd and realized that their political careers were dying in the shadow of Elias's corn. The power of the pen had been defeated by the power of the plow. Elias watched Thorne, who was now screaming into his phone, a pathetic figure amidst the overwhelming evidence of the land's resilience. The soil had spoken. It had revealed the hidden springs and the ancient nutrients, proving that a man who treats the earth with respect will never be truly poor. The moral redemption was complete. Elias wasn't an environmental hazard. He was the savior of a community that had been on the verge of losing its soul. The harvest was so massive that it overflowed from the baskets and into the beds of old pickup trucks, a wealth that no bank could ever quantify. As the sun climbed higher, the tension broke into a celebration. The machines were turned off. The surveyors packed up their stakes. The suit and his silt were washed away by a tide of green. Elias sat on his porch, watching the families carry the bounty of his sterile soil. He felt a quiet, profound peace. The land had never lied to him, and in the end, it was the only witness that mattered. The legacy was safe. The dirt was alive. And for the first time in a long time, the people of the valley were full. The trucks eventually left, their tires kicking up the dust of a defeat they couldn't explain. Marcus Thorne and his vision of concrete are gone, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of a farm that refuses to die. The county records still say one thing, but the bellies of 400 families say another. Elias remains on his porch, a man who understands that the only debt that truly matters is the one you owe to the earth beneath your boots. People come from all over now, not to see a liability, but to learn how a man can turn a graveyard into a garden. They ask for his secret, and he just points to the dirt. The land never lies to a man who treats it with respect. It remembers every drop of sweat and every seed planted in faith. Arrogance may build towers and draft laws, but it can't make a single blade of grass grow. In the end, the greedy will always starve on their own vanity, while those who work the earth will find that the soil always provides for its own. This is Beyond the Fields. Stand tall and keep your hands in the dirt.